Olá, pessoal. Bom dia. Bem-vindos, bem-vindas. Estamos muito felizes de receber Kristin Neff no Brasil, apesar de Zoom, mas é aqui no Brasil para falar para brasileiros e lançar o novo livro dela, o Autocompaixão, Feroz. Bom, eu sou a Érica, eu sou professora do programa criado pela Kristin e fiz a revisão técnica do livro e estou aqui representando o Vitor Barreto, que é o editor da Lúcida Letra. Rapidamente vou explicar para vocês o que é a editora Lúcida Letra, que então é uma editora que tem como foco publicar livros budistas e também livros de transformação e desenvolvimento que tenham o budismo como base, seja pela formação de seus autores, seja pelo conteúdo. A Lúcida Letra tem quase 60 títulos em catálogo e tem como propósito ser uma fonte confiável para conexão com as tradições budistas de sabedoria. A Autocompaixão Feroz é o segundo livro da Kristin, publicada pela editora, que também já lançou Tara Brah, John Halifax, Sua Santidade o Dalai Lama, Mingyur Rinpoche, entre outros. A Kristin, ela é doutora pela Universidade da Califórnia. Mas antes, vou já introduzir Kristin. Yes, welcome to Brazil.
Hi, Erica. Thanks so much for having me. It's not quite as nice on Zoom as in person, but still great to be here.
Then, Kristin é doutora pela Universidade da Califórnia, em Berkeley, e atualmente ela é professora associada de Psicologia Educacional na Universidade do Texas, em Austin. Durante o último ano de pós-graduação da Kristin, ela se interessou pelo budismo e vem praticando meditação na tradição Insight Meditation desde então. Ao fazer o seu trabalho de pós-doutorado, ela decidiu realizar pesquisa sobre a autocompaixão, um conceito que é central na psicologia budista e que ainda não havia sido examinado empiricamente. Kristin é pioneira no campo da pesquisa da autocompaixão e há quase 20 anos ela criou a escala de avaliação da autocompaixão, a Self-Compassion Scale, que ajudou assim, imensamente a divulgação, a difusão do conceito da autocompaixão. Então ela tem vários artigos acadêmicos, artigos de livros sobre o tema, e ela então é autora do livro Autocompaixão, Pare de se torturar e deixe a insegurança para trás, publicado no Brasil pela editora Lúcida Letra, e acaba de lançar o seu livro, que então ela está aqui para fazer o lançamento, Autocompaixão Feroz, como as mulheres podem fazer uso da bondade para se manifestar livremente, reivindicar o seu poder e prosperar. Junto com seu colega, o Dr. Chris Germer, ela criou o programa de treinamento com suporte empírico chamado Mindful Self-Compassion, que é ministrado por milhares de professores em todo o mundo e que pela primeira vez esse ano nós teremos a formação desse programa no Brasil com o professor Christopher Germer e com a professora Marta Alonso. O Vitor vai deixar para vocês o link no chat. Então, ela é coautora também do livro Manual de Mindfulness e Autocompaixão, editado aqui em português pela editora Artimed, e do livro Teaching the Mindful Self-Compassion Program, A Guide for Professionals. E é cofundadora do Center for Mindful Self-Compassion. Kristin, thank you.
Thank you, Erica. I love your dog. He's very, very cute.
Oh my God! Oh, Donatella.
Yeah, so thank you. Well, let me just talk a little bit about what self-compassion is, and in particular, what fierce self-compassion is, and why I've written this book. But some of the audience may not be that familiar with self-compassion, so let me just explain a little bit. So the word compassion from the Latin passion means to suffer, come is with. So it's basically how are we with our suffering? And from my understanding, from my reading of Buddhism and my practice of Buddhism, it's important that we're with suffering. First of all, that we're present with suffering, we're willing to acknowledge suffering. That's actually mindfulness, that we're able to be mindful of suffering. This can be that of others or ourselves. It's part of compassion is a warm response, a caring response, a desire to alleviate that suffering. Again, this could be other suffering or our own suffering. And then finally, really important, a sense of shared humanity. What differentiates compassion from pity is with pity, there's a sense of separation. If I pity you, I feel sorry for you, I look down on you. If I have compassion for you, I feel like, okay, we've had some similar experiences, we're both human beings. And the same with self-compassion. It's not self-pity, it's not feeling sorry for oneself. It's remembering that the human experience is flawed, we're all imperfect, there's nothing wrong with us for having difficulties happen. And so for most people, actually, it's fairly easy to feel compassion for others. We're raised with the idea that it's good to be compassionate to others. Most of us aren't very compassionate to ourselves. We treat ourselves quite differently from others. In other words, if you're to think about how you relate to yourself, especially when your difficulty comes from making a mistake or failing in some way, the types of things you say to yourself, you probably wouldn't say to your friends. And if you did say those to your friends, you probably wouldn't have very many friends. So the vast majority of people are kind, compassionate, and warm to others. Not everyone, but at least the people they're close to in their lives. But they treat themselves much more poorly. So self-compassion is really kind of a simple agenda. It involves including ourselves in the circle of compassion. And what we know is that when we do this, everything changes. So what happens when suffering arises? Again, this can be because of something we've done, a mistake we've made, or something difficult happens in our life. When we can't be with that suffering in a healthy way, when we get lost in it, or we criticize ourselves for having it, or we kind of ignore it and pretend it's not there, what happens is we get overwhelmed by our suffering, and it leads to things like depression or anxiety or problematic behaviors like eating disorders, or maybe even suicidal ideation if we just can't handle the pain. So what the research shows is that when we are with ourselves with compassion, in other words, when we have difficult thoughts or emotions, we're kind to ourselves. First of all, we're mindful. We're aware that this is hard for me right now. We're kind and warm to ourselves in response. And really importantly, we remember that this is part of the human experience. It's not just me. There's nothing wrong with me. This is actually what connects us. What the research shows is this really helps us cope with difficulty. So we have less depression, less anxiety, less psychopathology, things like a disordered eating or suicidal thoughts. But what's really interesting is when we're with our suffering in this kind, connected way, we're also happier. We're also more optimistic because compassion feels good. So that's basically, that was the work I was doing for the past maybe 15 years. And then the last few years, I've been interested in understanding two faces of compassion. And again, this can be both compassion outward or compassion inward. So there's a tender side of compassion, which is all about acceptance, right? So we might, someone else has made a mistake. We might still accept them as a human being and care for them. If we've made a mistake, we can still accept ourselves and care for ourselves. With tender self-compassion, there's a quality of nurturing, of gentleness, of wanting to soothe and alleviate and comfort in times of distress. It's kind of like a parent, right? You might have a newborn child, and especially when you're a new parent, that baby may be screaming its head off, but you don't care. If you're a compassionate parent, you just love that baby unconditionally. You hold that baby, you rock that baby, you soothe that baby, and eventually it starts to calm down. And so there's this nurturing, tender quality to self-compassion, which is very important. But in Buddhism, they also talk about another form of compassion, which is called fierce compassion. In other words, although compassion allows us to accept human beings, ourselves or others, We don't want to accept harmful behaviors. If someone is harming us or harming other people, it's not compassionate just to accept that harmful behavior. Or similarly, if there's a situation that's very unjust or harmful in some way, it's not compassionate to accept that situation. So again, remember, compassion is concerned with the alleviation of suffering. And so if we care, then we aren't going to accept behaviors or situations that are harmful. And so fierce self-compassion in the external world, there's a type of Buddhism called engaged Buddhism, where people actually go out in the world and, try to stand for social justice. Thich Nhat Hanh, who was as a Vietnamese Zen master, recently passed. He was a great example of this, fought for justice in Vietnam. So my work lately is to say, well, that's also true in terms of how we relate to ourselves. Right? There's also fierce self-compassion. In other words, there's not only acceptance, there's also the need to take action to prevent harm. So for instance, self-protection, drawing boundaries, really, really important. A lot of people have trouble drawing boundaries with others, partly because they want other people to like them. But if we don't draw clear boundaries, how can we protect ourselves? How can we be well if we just let other people continually harm us, or maybe don't give us the space we need to be well and do what we need to be happy and satisfied? Or similarly, very important, motivating change. So although we might accept ourselves, if we're doing a behavior that's harmful to ourselves or others, it's not compassionate to accept it. We want to change that behavior, but not because we're inadequate, but simply because we care and we want to be well and we want to be happy. So this is the fierce side of self-compassion. It takes action in the world. If you think of tender self-compassion metaphorically as mother, a fierce self-compassion is mama bear, that the energy of like a mother bear, when a mother bear is protecting her cubs, this ferocious, very strong, powerful energy comes up. And that's a really important part of compassion as well. So it's both. And what's really important, and a lot of the book is about this, is the balance between fierce and tender self-compassion. It's like yin and yang, right? The idea in Chinese philosophy. Yin is the more gentle energy of life. Yang is the more powerful, action-oriented energy of life. And we need them to be in balance in order to be whole. If we're too tender, we're too accepting, and there's not enough fierceness, not enough action, we may become complacent. We may let other people harm us, or the world, we may let the world continue to be an unjust place. On the other hand, if we're too much about action and, fierceness and maybe getting angry at things, and there's no tender acceptance, if we maybe, stand up to other people, but stop seeing them as human beings, or maybe with ourselves, let's say we see a behavior we don't like, if we start to criticize ourselves and dehumanize ourselves, then that's not helpful either. That's aggressive. So it's all about the balance between fierceness and tenderness. There's one major thing that stands in the way with our ability to balance fierce and tender self-compassion, however, and that is gender role socialization, right? So I'm not talking about biological sex. I'm talking about the way that males and females are raised in cultures. And this varies by culture, but there are some universals pretty much in most cultures. So in most cultures, boys are raised, they can be fierce, they can be angry, they can be action-oriented. But if a boy is too tender, if he's perceived as too sensitive, he might be called names, he may be picked on, he may be seen as weak. And the unfortunate thing for boys who later grow up to be men is they don't have as much access to the ability of self-acceptance and this warmth and this kindness in order to heal from some of the emotional difficulties of life. For women, on the other hand, women are allowed to be tender and nurturing, to others, not so much for ourselves, because for women, we really value self-sacrifice. We think that a woman shouldn't meet her own needs. A woman should only meet other people's needs. Ironically, that means that women have less self-compassion than men because they feel they aren't allowed to meet their own needs. And then also, women aren't allowed to be fierce, right? If a woman is too fierce, or if she's too successful or gets angry, God forbid she gets angry, people don't like that either. They call women different names. And what that means is sometimes women become disempowered. They don't feel comfortable speaking up, or society doesn't let them speak up. Or drawing boundaries, for instance, can be more difficult for women because our worth stems from people liking us, and people like women who are self-sacrificing. So basically, gender role socialization stands in the ability to balance fierce and tender self-compassion. Now, by the way, I'm not saying that everyone is going to express these the same way. Of course not. Everyone's a unique individual. But what self-compassion does, this is really key. If your sense of self-worth is intrinsic, right, it comes just because you are a human being worthy of compassion, worthy of kindness, worthy of meeting your own needs, then that means you can be your true, authentic self, which means that we aren't so constrained by gender roles. And so in my new book, I talk a lot about this. The book is aimed primarily at women, but men also get a lot from reading it because it talks a lot about gender in general. But particularly for women, it talks about how in certain contexts, for instance, in work contexts, because fierceness is valued so much, it's hard for us to balance fierceness and tenderness. And this actually harms women in the workplace. I also have a whole chapter on anger. So, anger, we think of it as this bad thing. When anger is aimed at preventing harm, it's useful. It's only when anger causes harm that it's not useful. But we need to be able to harness the useful power of anger to stand up for ourselves, to speak up, and to make change in the world. So I have a chapter on anger. I have a chapter on the Me Too movement, which is, I think, in many ways, and of course, these things they're all complicated, but at its core, the Me Too movement, I see it as women saying, fierce self-compassion, no, it's not okay. We aren't going to allow this to occur to us anymore, the sexual harassment, the sexual abuse. That actually that's that mama bear energy. That stems from love, that stems from caring about ourselves. I also talk a lot about family relationships and caring for others. So again, what we know very clearly in the research is that if you just give to others, if you just care about others, it goes one way, and you don't meet your own needs, you don't care for yourself, you will become depleted and you will burn out. In other words, you'll have nothing left to give. And so, especially the fierce self-compassion, if we turn that inward, if we say my needs count too, not more than others, but also, and if we meet our own needs, if we fill ourselves up with compassion, kindness, a sense of worthiness, what the research shows is that means we can care for others without burning out. We can sustain caring for others. So in other words, the more compassion flows inward, the more compassion can also flow outward. And so I have found this concept of fierce and tender self-compassion really useful, because when most people think of compassion, they only think of the tender, gentle side. But it's really important to realize that fierce self-compassion can help empower us, help make change in our own lives, help make change in the world. And that's why I'm so passionate about it. So I wanted to leave some time for questions with the audience. I've got about 10 minutes. I'm sorry, my time is limited this morning, so I only have about 10 minutes, but I'd love to open that up.
Yes, sim, Kristin.
Great.
Thank you so much. Kristin, temos algumas perguntas. A primeira pergunta é sobre parentalidade de pais e mães de pessoas autistas. Antes de te fazer essa pergunta, eu queria te dar um recado de uma grande amiga. Você é uma inspiração para as mulheres de uma comunidade aqui de São Paulo chamada Parelheiros. É uma comunidade onde as pessoas têm vulnerabilidade social, econômica, e você é uma inspiração para as mães de crianças com autismo. Elas se inspiram muito no exemplo, na maneira como você lidou com todas as dificuldades na maternidade do seu filho. E o Lucas, a pergunta do Lucas é sobre isso e diz assim: a parentalidade de mães e pais de pessoas autistas é abarcada por vários fatores de estresse, vulnerabilidade emocional e autocrítica severa. Como a autocompaixão feroz pode ajudar esse público? Em especial as mães, que são as pessoas que ficam como responsáveis diretas do cuidado e tutoria das crianças, enquanto os pais, quando se fazem presentes, eles são mais responsáveis pela questão econômica, financeira. Obrigada.
Right. So that's a big question. Let me deal with maybe the working with autistic children first. And this is why we remember we need both fierce and tender self-compassion. We need both simultaneously. So so dealing with my son Rowan, for instance, if he is having, when he was little, he had severe tantrums. Now, by the way, now he's doing great. He's graduating high school. He still has some issues. They aren't tantrums, but he can get in these little kind of loops where it's hard to reach him when he gets a negative thought. For instance, it can kind of spiral. So first of all, it's important that in terms of the tender self-compassion to aim it inward, because our mind state impacts our children. This is whether our children are autistic or neurotypical. So if you're very self-critical and you just, oh, it's my fault, I triggered a tantrum, or I'm not doing this well, or when we're hard on ourselves, people read our emotions. So autistic children, as well as neurotypical children, they can have empathy for our emotional state. Autistic children are actually very sensitive, believe it or not, to others' emotional states. That's partly why they withdraw. So if what we bring to our children is a mind state of criticism or harshness, then that, I found with Rowan, that would actually increase his tantrums. If he was having a tantrum and I would just be really angry at myself or really, really super frustrated, his tantrum might increase. But if I could give myself compassion for how difficult it was, how hard it was in that moment, I would kind of open my heart to myself. This is the tender side. I would open my heart to myself. I would calm myself. I would soothe myself. Then I would find he would start to calm down, right? So it's not selfish at all for parents to be self-compassionate. In fact, we can help regulate our children's emotions. Hopefully you can translate, regulate. We can help our children deal with their difficult emotions, partly by helping ourselves deal with our difficult emotions. So this happens both at the level of our brains, but also if we do it out loud, if we speak out loud in a kind of kind, compassionate way to ourselves as well as our children, we're also modeling that. In terms of the fierce self-compassion, so, I mean, it is true that as a parent of an autistic child, you can't, you have to meet maybe more needs of your children than maybe some other parents do. I mean, all parents have to meet their children's needs, but there are some limitations that mean you can't meet all your own needs. That's just part of being an autism parent. But you can try to, as much as you can, say that actually it's really important that I have some time for myself, that to recognize actually can't meet all my children's needs, if I don't meet any of my own needs, I'm going to have nothing left over to give to my child. So part of fierce self-compassion is saying, taking action to meet our own needs. And this is really important that as mothers, that we maybe don't have as much time as we like, but if we have the mindset that says, I need, it's not just a luxury, I need to take some time for myself so that I will have resources to give to others, then you start prioritizing that. Instead of feeling guilty about it, you say, wow, I am helping my child as well as myself because I'm going to take this time for myself, for instance. And then in terms of with the husbands, now this gets complicated, okay, because we're talking about different cultures and it just depends on the particular type of marriage. But what's really important, everyone has to make decisions that are right for them. You don't want to do anything that's going to harm your marriage, put your family in jeopardy, of course. What self-compassion gives you is the understanding that you have a right to be upset if you feel you aren't being treated fairly, for instance. That if you feel that some of the childcare should be more shared, if you want to break, and maybe your husband doesn't agree with that. How you express it is going to depend on you and what's right for your marriage. I'm not going to give you advice that way. But what I will say, the advice I will give is that internally, we need to own that as human beings, we have the right to be treated fairly, and that we are worthy of being treated fairly, and that we are worthy of having our needs be met. And then how you work that out in real life is complicated. I'm not going to get into that one. So hopefully that's kind of helpful. That was a very long answer. I'm sorry. I think we may only have time for one more question.
Ok, Kristin, uma pergunta a mais. Pergunta da Giovana. Quando pensamos em autocompaixão, isso pode parecer uma prática bastante autocentrada, mas como isso pode ajudar em movimentos de grupo, ativismo e a construção de uma comunidade?
Well, so the whole book, Fierce Self-Compassion, is really about this. The word self is kind of incorrect in a way. I should have called it inner compassion. There's very little self in self-compassion. It just means that compassion is this way and that way. In fact, that's that sense of common humanity that's key to compassion, which makes it, self-pity is self-centered. Self-compassion is not self-centered. It's saying that all human beings, including myself, because I'm not separate from others, all human beings are worthy of compassion. And from that interconnected state of mind, right, it also means that if other people are, other people, to the extent they exist, are being treated unfairly, right, and this is what social justice movements stem from, that also impacts me. Right. So basically, all human beings, including myself, need to be treated fairly. If we just focus on our own personal happiness and we don't pay attention to the world around us, that also affects us. It's an illusion to think it doesn't. But here's what's important. If we take that too extremely and think that it's all about self-sacrifice, that other people are more important than me and my needs don't count and I should only be helping others, that doesn't work either, right? From the very practical stance of first, you won't have the energy to help others if you're overwhelmed, if you're exhausted, if you're depleted. But also just in terms of if you deny your own humanity in the effort to honor the humanity of others, you're still denying humanity. So compassion is, in Buddhism, they call it 360-degree compassion. It includes everyone. And from the Buddhist perspective, including things like animals as well. So it's really not self-centered. It's actually more inclusive if we turn the lens inward and outward simultaneously. And I think that's a good note to end on. And just to say, I really hope that this book helps to give people a framework to understand how self-compassion fits into social justice movements, because I think is absolutely key. It's not enough for us just to be happy personally and not, care about the world. We're interconnected. We are one. We are one. Ok.
Kristin, muito, muito, muito obrigada. Foi maravilhoso. Nós estamos muito felizes. E também agradeço em nome de todas as pessoas que estão aqui te assistindo com o coração quentinho aqui nessa manhã um pouco gelada no Brasil, em alguns lugares do Brasil.
Oh.
Obrigada.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a great day. Bye-bye. Pessoal, então, muito, muito obrigada a participação de todos. A gente se despede por aqui. A live vai ficar gravada no YouTube da Lúcida Letra, acho que até amanhã, né? Tem um tempinho aí para ela ficar lá. Então, muito obrigada pela presença de vocês. Tchau, tchau.